A chair leg squealed across the polished floor of the hotel ballroom, and it cut through the soft wedding music like a mistake somebody couldn't take back. The room was already leaning toward laughter. A few people were holding their phones low at their hips, recording without admitting they were recording. The black man near the back kept his hands folded in front of him like he didn't know what to do with them. His thrift store suit was clean but a little too big in the shoulders, and the tie sat slightly off-center like he'd fixed it 3 times and still didn't trust it. At the head table, the groom's phone buzzed against a water glass, making the ice clink. The groom glanced down at the screen, then up at the man in the back. His face changed in a way that made the bridesmaids stop smiling mid-photo. He pushed his chair back, stood up so fast the microphone popped, and for a second it felt like the whole room forgot how to breathe. He walked straight down the center aisle, past the flower arrangements and the champagne flutes, his dress shoes loud on the floor. He stopped in front of the black man and didn't speak right away. He simply drew his shoulders back and lifted his hand to his forehead in a clean, sharp command salute. The room froze. And then the groom spoke, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Sir," he said, voice tight, "permission to address you." The black man blinked like he wasn't sure this was real, like he expected someone to laugh and say it was a joke. His eyes moved around the room, taking in faces that were suddenly careful, suddenly polite. "Don't do that," he whispered, barely audible. The groom didn't drop his hand. "Yes, sir," he said, like the words belonged to him. And that was when the whispers died completely, because nobody could pretend they didn't understand what was happening anymore. Part 1. The Weight of Reality. 2 days earlier, Leonard Gray stood in the break room of the Amazon Fulfillment Center outside Columbus, Ohio, staring at the snack machine like it had personally offended him. His badge lanyard still hung around his neck even though his shift ended 20 minutes ago. He could feel the tiredness in his knees, the deep kind that didn't leave after a shower, the kind that settled in and acted like it paid rent. His phone was in his hand, screen lit up with a past due notice from the electric company. The amount wasn't even huge, but it might as well have been a mountain. He had moved the bill from one week to the next so many times it started to feel like he was playing a game designed for him to lose. His checking account had $28 and some change. Payday was Friday. Today was Tuesday. A coworker named Daryl leaned against the counter, tearing open a protein bar. "Man, you coming to Devin's wedding?" he asked, chewing. Leonard didn't look up right away. "I wasn't invited," he said. Daryl snorted like that was funny. "You were invited. Everybody got an invite." It was in the team chat. Leonard finally turned. "I don't do group chats," he said, which was a half-truth. He had the chat muted because it was mostly memes and people arguing about overtime. But he'd seen Devin's wedding talk, seen people planning outfits like it was a holiday. Daryl eyed Leonard's work shoes and the crease lines on his pants. "Bro, just come. Free food. Open bar. You call this a night out." Leonard gave him a look. "You ever been to a wedding where you don't belong?" he asked, calm, but his chest tightened as he said it. Daryl shrugged, not really hearing him. "It's at the downtown hotel. Fancy." He grinned. "Just don't wear those." Leonard didn't laugh. He waited until Daryl left, then walked out into the parking lot with his lunch bag swinging at his side. The air had that cold edge that came early in Ohio, the kind that made you zip your jacket even if you were trying to act tough. His old Honda started on the second try, engine coughing like it was tired too. On the drive home, he passed a Starbucks near a strip mall. The line of cars curled around the building. People with jobs that didn't make their feet hurt sat in warm cars, waiting for drinks that cost more than his lunch. Leonard didn't hate them. He was too tired to hate. But he noticed everything now, like his brain couldn't stop counting the distance between him and other people's normal. His apartment was on the second floor of a low building that smelled like cooking oil and laundry soap. The hallway lights flickered like they were trying to save money too. Inside, It was quiet except for the refrigerator hum and the sound of his neighbor's TV through the wall. Leonard dropped his keys in the bowl by the door and stood there for a minute with his hand on the doorknob, like he expected someone to be behind him, like he expected a home to feel like something. But it didn't. It felt like a place he paid to store his exhaustion. He changed into sweatpants and sat on the edge of his bed with his phone. His sister's name was still pinned at the top of his messages, even though she hadn't texted him in months. Not because she didn't care, but because life had punched both of them in the mouth and neither one had figured out how to talk about it. He opened his email instead. There was another message from the temp agency he used to work with, offering shifts that paid less than what he made now. There was a reminder for a dentist appointment he couldn't afford. There was a birthday email from a restaurant he'd never been to. Then there was a calendar notification, one he didn't remember setting.
Devin's wedding.
Saturday.
Downtown Columbus.
Black tie optional. Leonard stared at it for a long time. He thought about Devin, the young guy from his shift who laughed too loud and talked about his fiancée like she was the center of the universe. Devin was one of those people who didn't hide his happiness. Sometimes Leonard admired that. Sometimes it irritated him, like a bright light when you had a headache. Leonard's stomach growled. He stood up, opened a cabinet, and found a single can of soup and half a sleeve of crackers. He ate at the small table by the window and watched headlights move across the parking lot. Somewhere down the hall, a baby cried, then quieted. His phone buzzed. A voicemail notification. From a number he didn't recognize. He didn't play it right away. He stared at the screen like it might bite him. Unknown numbers meant bill collectors, meant bad news, meant something else he'd have to carry. He set the phone down and went to wash his spoon.
The water ran cold at first.
He stood there, hands under the stream, letting the chill keep him awake. Then, finally, he dried his hands and pressed play. A woman's voice came through, slightly shaky, like she'd recorded it in her car.
Hi, Leonard Gray? My name is Rachel Enson.
I'm not sure if you remember me. We met a long time ago. I'm calling because I'm trying to reach someone who served with my brother, Devin. He's getting married this weekend and, she paused, swallowed hard. He said your name. He said you were the one person he wanted there. He said it mattered.
If this is the wrong number, I'm sorry.
If it's you, please call me back. Leonard sat down slowly, like his legs gave up. He replayed the voicemail. Then again.
Devin.
Served. Leonard felt the old memory rise up, not as a movie scene, but as a sensation. Heat. Dust. The weight of a backpack. The sound of someone trying to joke when nobody felt like laughing. A younger Devin, not in a warehouse vest, but in a uniform, eyes too bright for what he'd seen. Leonard had spent years building a wall between then and now. He told himself it was survival. He told himself it was moving on. But walls didn't just keep pain out. They kept everything out. He looked at the calendar notification again. Saturday. He didn't know if he could walk into a ballroom full of people who only knew him as that older guy from work. He didn't know if he could handle the questions, the stares, the way people smiled when they were uncomfortable. He didn't know if he could handle Devin, either. Devin's wedding was supposed to be joyful. Leonard felt like he carried a storm inside him. He didn't want to bring that into someone else's sunlight. His phone buzzed again, this time a text from Daryl. You going Saturday, or what? LOL. Leonard didn't answer. He set the phone face down on the table like that could make the pressure disappear. Outside his window, the parking lot lights cast a yellow glow. He could see his own reflection faintly in the glass. A tired man. A man trying to hold his life together with cheap tape and stubbornness. He stood up and walked into his closet. He pulled out the suit he wore to his mother's funeral, still in a plastic bag. The shoulders were too wide because he'd lost weight since then. The fabric smelled like old dust and time. He held it up, staring at it like it was asking him a question. And in the silence of his apartment, Leonard realized something that scared him more than bills or loneliness. He wasn't just avoiding a wedding. He was avoiding being seen. Leonard waited a full day before calling the number back. Not because he forgot, but because he needed the time to let the feeling settle without drowning in it. Wednesday passed in a blur of conveyor belts, scanner beeps, and the dull ache in his lower back. He said the right things when spoken to and nothing when he wasn't. His mind kept drifting back to the voicemail, to the way Rachel's voice cracked when she said Devon's name, to the word mattered, which felt heavier than it should have. On Thursday morning, he finally called during his lunch break. He sat in his car with the engine off, the steering wheel cold under his palms.
The phone rang twice.
Hello. Rachel answered, cautious but hopeful. It's Leonard, he said. His voice sounded older than he felt.
You left me a message.
There was a pause, then a breath he could hear clearly through the phone. Oh, thank you for calling back. I was worried I had the wrong number. You didn't, he said.
I remember you.
You were always dropping Devon off late because he'd miss the bus.
She laughed softly.
He never changed. No, Leonard said. He didn't. They talked for a few minutes about small things. Where she lived now. How long she'd been helping with the wedding. Leonard kept waiting for the real reason, the part that made her reach out after all these years. She got there, eventually. He's been asking about you, she said. For months. He told me stories I'd never heard before. About how you watched out for him when things were rough. Leonard stared at the dashboard. I just did my job, he said. He says you did more than that, she replied gently. He said when he thought about quitting, about walking away from everything, you were the one who told him to stay. That it was okay to be scared and still keep going. Leonard swallowed. He remembered that night.
A folding chair under a bare bulb.
Devon sitting with his elbows on his knees, hands shaking just enough to notice. Leonard hadn't said anything heroic. He'd just told the truth, the kind nobody put on posters. I don't know if I belong there, Leonard said quietly. Rachel didn't rush him. You don't have to do anything, she said. I just wanted you to know he'd be really disappointed if you weren't. After they hung up, Leonard stayed in the car longer than he needed to. He watched people come and go, sipping drinks, scrolling their phones, living lives that didn't include him. He told himself he was fine with that. He'd practiced being invisible. That night, his neighbor knocked on his door. Mrs. Alvarez from across the hall, holding a small plastic container. I made too much rice, she said, like it was a crime.
You want some?
Leonard hesitated, then took it. Thank you, he said. She glanced at the suit bag hanging in his open closet. You going somewhere nice? She asked. Wedding, he said. She smiled. Good. People forget to celebrate when life gets heavy. He didn't argue. Friday came with rain and the kind of gray sky that made the city feel smaller. Leonard went to the thrift store after work, more out of habit than hope. He found a tie that wasn't perfect but sat straighter than his old one. At the counter, the cashier rang him up and said, "Looks sharp, like it was nothing." On Saturday morning, Leonard woke early. His phone buzzed with a text from Devon. "Hope you're coming today." Would mean a lot. Leonard stared at it. He typed, deleted, typed again. Finally, he wrote, "I'll be there." He stood in front of the mirror longer than usual, adjusting the tie, smoothing the jacket. He noticed the lines in his face, the way his hair had gone gray at the temples. He didn't look like a guest in a wedding magazine. He looked like himself. The hotel ballroom was brighter than he expected. Chandeliers reflected off polished floors. Music hummed low, and laughter bounced off the walls. Leonard felt the familiar tightening in his chest as eyes flicked toward him, some curious, some dismissive. He took a seat near the back, folding his hands the way he always did when he didn't know what to do with them. A woman nearby whispered something to her friend. Someone else snorted. Leonard kept his gaze forward, focusing on the steady rhythm of his breathing. He reminded himself he was here for Devon, not for anyone else. Then the groom stood up. And the room changed. Leonard felt the moment before he understood it. The shift in the room wasn't loud. It was subtle, like air pressure changing before a storm. Chairs stopped scraping. Glasses stopped clinking. Even the band seemed to lose its place for half a beat. The groom was standing now, not smiling the way grooms usually smiled. His posture was different. Straighter. Older somehow. Leonard recognized it instantly, and the recognition hit him in the chest like a physical thing. No, he thought.
Don't do this.
People turned in their seats as Devon stepped away from the head table. Someone laughed nervously, like they expected a joke. Leonard kept his eyes down, fixed on the floor, because he already felt the heat crawling up his neck. Being noticed had never been the plan. When Devon stopped in front of him, Leonard looked up despite himself. Devon's eyes were wet, not dramatic, just honest.
The kind of wet you got when you were holding something back.
Then came the salute. Clean.
Sharp. No hesitation.
Leonard's stomach dropped. His hands opened and closed at his sides without him telling them to. The room went silent in the way only rooms full of people could go silent, thick with confusion and curiosity.
Don't, Leonard whispered, instinctive, protective.
He didn't want this moment. He didn't want the attention, the explanations, the questions that would follow. He had spent years shrinking himself so nothing spilled out. But Devon didn't drop his hand. Sir, Devon said, voice steady but tight. Permission to address you. Leonard stood slowly, not because he wanted to, but because his body remembered what to do. His knees protested. His heart thudded hard against his ribs. He nodded once. Granted, he said, just as quietly. A few people in the room shifted uncomfortably. Someone in the back muttered, "What is this?" Leonard didn't look. He couldn't. Devon finally lowered his hand, but he didn't step back. "This man," he said, turning to face the room, "is the reason I'm standing here today." Leonard felt the floor tilt slightly. "He was my squad leader," Devon continued. "When I was 22 and scared out of my mind and pretending I wasn't, he noticed. When I messed up, he corrected me without tearing me down. When I wanted to quit, he sat with me and told me the truth. Not the motivational speech stuff.
The real stuff."
Leonard's throat tightened. He remembered that night clearly now.
The flickering light.
The smell of burnt coffee. Devon asking, voice low, if it ever stopped feeling heavy. Leonard had said, "It doesn't."
"You just get stronger."
Devon looked back at him. "He taught me what leadership actually looks like," he said. "Quiet. Consistent. Unseen." A ripple moved through the room.
Leonard saw faces change, confusion giving way to something else. Respect, maybe.
Or discomfort at realizing they'd gotten someone wrong. Leonard wanted to tell Devon to stop. To let it go. To keep the focus where it belonged. But his chest felt like it was caving inward, filled with things he'd never said out loud. "I didn't come tonight to embarrass him," Devon said. "I came to honor him."
Leonard's vision blurred.
He blinked hard, annoyed at himself. He wasn't a crier. He'd learned early that tears didn't fix anything. But something inside him cracked anyway. For years, Leonard had been carrying the idea that what he did back then didn't matter. That it was just another job, another chapter that closed quietly. He told himself nobody remembered. Nobody cared. That the world moved on without pausing for men like him. Standing there, under chandeliers and strangers' stares, that story finally fell apart. Devon reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I keep this in my wallet," he said. "It's something you told me. You probably don't even remember." Leonard knew he did. He just hadn't realized Devon did. "You said," Devon read, "your value doesn't disappear just because nobody's clapping."
The words landed heavy in Leonard's chest.
"I've been clapping ever since," Devon said. "Even when you weren't around to hear it." The room was quiet again, but this time it felt different. Softer. Leonard noticed Rachel standing near the aisle, her hand covering her mouth, tears running freely now. He noticed Daryl from work frozen in his seat, mouth slightly open. He noticed the people who had laughed earlier now avoiding his eyes. Leonard took a breath. Then, another. He realized how much energy he'd spent making himself small. How often he'd chosen silence over the risk of being misunderstood. How he'd mistaken invisibility for safety.
"Devin," Leonard said, voice rough, "you don't owe me this." Devin shook his head.
"I know," he said. "I want to." Leonard nodded once. That was all he could manage.
As Devin walked back to the head table, the room slowly came back to life.
People shifted. Someone cleared their throat. The band picked up again, a little tentative at first. Leonard sat down, hands trembling slightly now that the moment had passed. He stared straight ahead, heart still racing, thoughts loud and tangled. He had survived worse than this. But this felt harder in a different way. Because it asked him to accept something he'd never allowed himself before. That maybe his life, even in all its unfinished, struggling parts, had meant something. And that maybe the hardest thing wasn't enduring loss or failure. It was letting yourself be seen. The applause didn't come right away. It arrived in pieces, like people were testing whether it was allowed. A few claps here, then more, until the sound filled the ballroom without ever turning loud or showy. Leonard kept his eyes forward. He didn't stand. He didn't wave. He let the noise pass over him like rain. When it finally settled, the wedding moved on. Dinner was served. Glasses were refilled. The band eased into something familiar and safe. People laughed again, but it was different now. Careful. Thoughtful.
Leonard sat through the meal mostly in silence.
A woman at his table leaned over at one point and said, "That was really something," like she didn't know what else to say. He nodded, politely. Another man shook his hand and thanked him for his service. Leonard thanked him back, automatic, the words well-worn. What surprised him was how tired he felt. Not the bone-deep exhaustion he carried from work, but a softer kind.
Emotional, maybe.
Like he'd been holding his breath for years and finally let it out all at once. After the speeches and the first dance, Leonard slipped out onto the terrace. The night air was cool, carrying the smell of rain and city pavement. Downtown Columbus glowed in the distance, office windows lit up like small squares of other people's lives. He leaned against the railing and stared out, hands resting flat on the cold metal. Rachel joined him a few minutes later. She didn't speak right away. She just stood there, shoulder to shoulder, like she understood silence didn't always need fixing. "Thank you for coming," she said eventually. Leonard nodded. "Thank you for calling." She smiled, wiping under her eyes. He's been waiting a long time to do that.
Leonard exhaled slowly.
He didn't have to. "I know," she said. But he needed to. They stood quietly again. Inside, the music shifted to something upbeat. Laughter drifted through the open doors. Rachel glanced at him. "You okay?" Leonard considered the question honestly. "I think so," he said. "I just didn't realize how much I was still carrying." She nodded like she understood exactly what he meant. When Leonard finally left the wedding, It was earlier than most people. He said his goodbyes to Devon, who hugged him tight without saying much. That felt right too. Some things didn't need words. The drive home was quiet.
No radio.
No podcasts. Just the hum of the road and the steady rhythm of his thoughts. He replayed the night in pieces, not obsessively, but gently.
De salute.
The words. The way the room had changed. He pulled into his apartment parking lot and sat in the car for a moment before going inside. His phone buzzed. A text from Daryl.
Man.
I had no idea. Respect. Leonard stared at it, then typed back. Thanks. Inside his apartment, the silence felt different. Not empty. Just calm. He hung the suit back in the closet, smoothing the sleeve like it mattered. He washed his face in the bathroom sink and caught his reflection again. He looked the same.
Same taller dais.
Same lines. Same life waiting for him on Monday morning. But something had shifted underneath. The next week wasn't magically easier. The electric bill didn't disappear. His knees still hurt after long shifts. The warehouse was still loud and unforgiving. But Leonard noticed small things he hadn't before. He spoke up once during a team meeting instead of staying quiet. Just a suggestion about scheduling, nothing dramatic. The supervisor nodded and wrote it down. Mrs. Alvarez knocked again one evening, this time asking if he could help carry groceries. He said yes without hesitation. He finally texted his sister. Went to a wedding this weekend.
Made me think of you.
She replied an hour later. Been thinking of you too. Leonard sat on his couch and stared at that message longer than necessary, a faint smile pulling at his mouth. One night, as he was getting ready for bed, he found the folded receipt from the thrift store tie still in his pocket. He flattened it on the table, then surprised himself by placing it carefully in the same bowl as his keys.
A small reminder.
Proof that the day had happened. Leonard didn't walk around feeling transformed. He didn't suddenly believe everything would work out. Life hadn't taught him to trust that easily. But he did start allowing the idea that his worth wasn't tied to how loud his life looked from the outside. That showing up again and again, even when nobody noticed, still mattered. Sometimes the impact you make doesn't come with applause. Sometimes it shows up years later, in a quiet room, when you least expect it. And sometimes, all it takes to keep going is one moment that reminds you you were never as invisible as you thought. Leonard turned off the light and lay back, the city humming softly outside his window. Tomorrow would come with its usual weight. But tonight, for the first time in a long while, that weight felt manageable. And that felt like enough.